Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Grave Assembly had this to say on Reddit, CA Freeman. As it stands today, we're seeing all the right signs that the hotfix is effective at restoring Lizardmen and Tomb King's AI to a better state. They're recruiting armies, challenging nearby factions, and interacting with campaigns in line with our expectations. And then, he continues, we've observed the cast dwarves are now recruiting elite dwarf units, though we will call out that many of their army comps that we've reviewed still show them filling their armies with hobgoblins and orc labor units. They aren't the focus of this hotfix. This is about Lizardmen and Tomb Kings, but it is something that we'll be wanting to follow up on after we've rolled out 6.3.2. And then he goes on about Changeling, Maneater, and so on and so forth. Now, here's my perspective. I think it's fine if the hotfix is just about Lizardmen and Tomb Kings, and to some extent Beastmen, which are also not working whatsoever. And we're not talking about Beastmen where they were before 6.3, we're just talking about Beastmen flat out not functioning as factions at the moment. So hopefully they do fix that, but then, of course, there is going to be the bigger discussion on what Creative Assembly should do going forward. I think CA needs to communicate to the player base that they're working on certain things, certain clear things, not vague, it's like, oh, we're looking at this. No, here's what we're planning on doing, here's how we're going to do it, and maybe give some approximation of like when that would come out. Maybe yes or no. I think that's up to their marketing teams, their PR teams, their community managers on how they want to handle that. But this brings up a point. One of the things I've brought up over and over and over again in my videos is that the key issue of Warhammer 3 is that it has an inverted difficulty curve. So you start campaign, and once you start the campaign, the early game is the most challenging part. Doesn't matter which Legendary Lord we're talking about, doesn't matter which race we're talking about, it's always the same stuff. But here's an idea. What if we took factions that are ridiculously strong and can break the campaign, like the Changeling, like Maneater, and instead use those faction mechanics as kind of events to make the sandbox campaign more dynamic. Not so much as an endgame crisis, but more like a dynamic crisis. Something that starts, let's say, 10, 15 turns into a campaign, and then just continues throughout the campaign unless you deal with it. That, I think, would work much better than what we currently have right now, where a lot of people don't care about the endgame crisis, so they play without it, or even if they play with it, the endgame crisis is not a great system. So there are things that CA could do on this. It would be a lot of work, undeniably so, but some things are easier to do than others. For instance, with the Beastmen, well, we already have the event where Beastmen factions will just keep spawning throughout the course of your campaign. Minor factions, major factions, powerful armies, weak armies, etc. Well, what if CA decide to do this? We're going to remove all the Beastmen factions from the campaign, so you don't have to deal with the annoyance of them razing territory to the ground that you want to take. It's not that Beastmen are so difficult to deal with, it's more so like, oh great, they raze everything to the ground, now I have to rebuild it, or you ignore that campaign area until some AI faction does that for you. That's not a good dynamic. So remove the Beastmen factions, and instead, after say 15 turns of a campaign, Beastmen factions, major and minor factions, would start spawning in certain areas with advance warning. They would spawn in areas where there's a lot of bloodshed. So if there's a lot of fighting in, say, the Empire, they would spawn in some portion of the Empire. If there's a lot of fighting in Lustria, and there would be obviously fighting in Lustria, there would be fighting in Agron, etc. Wolf 1 obviously shouldn't factor into this because of the specifics of Wolf 1, unless, say, for instance, Wolf 1 is half in ruin. Then Beastmen might be able to get a foothold. And once they start getting a foothold in an area, because everyone's fighting each other, everyone's killing each other, then they would start getting armies. And they would use the full potential of their faction. They would raise territory, they would get extra armies, they would get marks of ruination very quickly. They could be a problem if you ignore it. That's just an idea. There could be events tied to this, but this would be a way to create a situation where the player can't just ignore their home front, or they can't just instantly conquer territory without considering the cost of conquering territory. Now, Beastmen, who they're aggressive to, well, they should be kind of aggressive to everyone, even Chaos to some extent, like, because they are a force of death and destruction. Well, maybe with Chaos you can avoid it, but that's essentially it. And not necessarily with all Chaos factions, but I'm thinking someone like Archeon, Be'lakor, and so on. They could avoid fighting Beastmen, and they could use the Chaos that Beastmen are creating for their own benefit. That's just one idea with regards to the Beastmen. What about the Changeling then? What could Creative Assembly do with the Changeling? Well, with the Changeling, his faction right now just does nothing in a campaign. So instead of having the Changeling just wasting all of our time in Stirland and just being an annoyance, either a very frustrating one or a meaningless one, instead we could have a global scheme system where the Changeling is trying to do his minor schemes in a theater, and you can try and stop him. If you don't stop him, some minor armies of siege spawn, but also the Changeling completes that scheme. So you could have an event, you can try and intercept him, fight an army, or multiple armies, or some situation. But if he completes enough schemes, he gets the theater scheme. So with the Empire, that would be a battle to fight against the Changeling to prevent the Empire Civil War. In the Darklands, it would be a question of fighting against the Changeling if you're Chaos Dwarves, or fighting for the Changeling if you're a race like Greenskins. And neutral races could choose either way. Like, okay, we can fight alongside him to screw over the Chaos Dwarves, or we can fight against him for our own benefit. Pros and cons, the kind of decisions. Like in an Empire, for instance, if you're Chaos or Vlad, you would obviously want to take advantage of Chaos in the Empire. The Empire would obviously want to stop it, so would High Elves, so Dwarves. But Vlad, you could choose. You could choose, okay, do I want an Empire Civil War? Or do I want to keep the Empire together and, deal with them from a vassalization perspective, diplomacy perspective? Because that is actually a choice as vampire counts. You do have that decision to be made. So there's a lot of different possibilities with the Changeling. With Maneater, an Ogre mercenary system, a global system, as opposed to the camps we currently have. So instead of having meaningless factions of the Ogres around the campaign map, we could have Ogre mercenaries that we can hire globally or in certain areas. And we could build a reputation with Ogre mercenaries, and the more reputation we get, if we keep our contracts, for instance, we would just hire units early on that build some reputation, and we can start hiring armies for a certain period of time, either attached to our main armies or their own way. How they would handle that with DLC is a discussion. But eventually you would start building up reputation more and more and more, but you could also lose reputation. If you go bankrupt, you break your contract, you lose reputation. That could obviously be something that hurts you. But eventually it builds up towards you hiring Maneater, either under direct control if you own Omens of Destruction, or as an AI faction if you don't own Omens of Destruction. You could also have access to some really awesome stuff from the Ogres, like regiments right now, like Eshin Maneater would be a significant win on that. Obviously, on a contract basis with some of these things, so certain duration, you can extend it, and maybe you get a reduction in contract costs if your reputation is high enough. So pros and cons: low reputation costs more, maybe some downsides. If you're in the negative, start with neutral. You can either go negative if you screw the Ogres, you go positive if you keep your word. That is, by the way, something that happens in the lore. This is exactly why Belegar actually ended up getting killed in End Times, because he pissed off Maneater when he hired him, and so Skarsnik took advantage of that. That's what I really think about with Maneater, as opposed to him just being there in the Empire, doing nothing, and not really having any real diplomacy. And also, AI factions could be trying to outbid you for Maneater, trying to get that power for themselves, and you kind of are starting that bidding war yourself. You can ignore it and just fight Maneater if you want to, or if an AI faction hires it, or you can try and get him on his side. That's how mercenaries work in history and in Warhammer lore. Then we'd have Skulltaker, Arbol, and Oxyatl. So if we look at Skulltaker, if we look at Arbol in the lore and in the game, and then we look at Oxyatl specifically just in the game, What are their campaign mechanics, essentially? Well, they're out there seeking out challenges. Different levels of challenges, but say, for instance, you're playing an Order faction, right? You might get the situation where, depending on the area you're in and randomization, it's like, oh, Skulltaker challenges you to a duel, or Arbol is looking to attack a certain faction, and you can ignore that, which just gives them more strength, absolutely. Or you can fight them and win, which reduces the risk that you have. Or you can fight them and lose, in which case they get stronger. But eventually this starts building up more and more and more. And eventually, factions like Axiatl, Arbol, and Skulltaker would just launch massive invasions against their foe. So like Axiatl, he'd be aimed at Chaos, because that's what he does in his campaign. He's trying to stop the forces of chaos, or forces of disorder. Whereas Skulltaker and Arbol could be like the Chaos version of it. How that would work with like more neutral factions is the discussion on the subject, but it is just an idea. And there's many other things. We can talk about Snitch, for instance, with his assassination schemes as an example. We can talk about Alifanar as another example, X, Y, and Z factions. But there's so much potential, untapped potential, that Creative Assembly could use in their game, as opposed to just, oh, let's make a cool legendary lord with really unique mechanics, and then we don't do that. Legendary Lord does nothing when under AI control. That is absolutely not the way I think Total War should be. But that's my perspective. Let me know what you guys think. Obviously, specifics of implementation or things that Creative Assembly could do are very much up in the air, but it's just an idea. Use those faction mechanics, that unique mechanics, ideals of a faction, as some kind of dynamic crisis in a campaign to really spice up the sandbox. It will really help the long-term potential of campaigns. Stay tuned for more.